Egypt was known since the ancient times with magic. It was widespread and had a great and important power, for it was practiced amongst all levels of the society. Magic was highly connected with the beliefs of the ancient Egyptians and their religious thinking, for they mixed it with their deities and considered it from the power and authority of the gods. The great magicians occupied high positions among the priests. The gods used magic in the struggles between them and each other, like Horus and Set. Greeks spoke highly of the knowledge of the Egyptians of magic, and the magicians of Egypt were mentioned in the story of Moses in Quran. The mention of the miracle of the stick is a decisive proof of how good the Egyptians were in magic, for it was habitual for the messengers and prophets to be sent with miracles in things which their people excelled at. It was clear how the magical rituals and the telling of the spells were connected with the reciting priest Hari-Hotep. This priest was the first tutor in the business of magic and charm. He had practiced the task of expelling evil spirits, and in the same time he treated ill cases like the fever and the bite of snakes and scorpions and other difficult diseases. Magic was fulfilled by telling spells and by using amulets. Magic consisted of an essence that was subject to its purpose and not to its essence. There were many purposes of magic in ancient Egypt, for in the normal life, the protective magic was practiced to expel evil spirits and to stop the dangers of predator animals, in addition of the desire to terminate the diseases and avoid envious eyes. This protective magic was the most common one and depends on the rules of good magic, which systems were placed since antiquity. The Egyptian magic is a science derived from books, for the magician used special books of magical spells that are fit to each case and recites these spells by himself. That's what's known as the oral rituals. Usually, these spells that are told are followed by tasks and things that were ought to be done, which are the practical rituals. For the magic to achieve its effect, some religious spells were recited, or the person carries some amulets that take the shape of protective deities, so that they could achieve the protection purpose, or some amulets took the form of sacred symbols. The ancient Egyptian wanted to have all what's useful by wearing these amulets or read spells and write on the amulet some of the prayers. These means gave magical powers and expelled all what's harmful to the person who carries them. They also brought good luck, in addition to speeding up the healing. Magic in ancient Egypt was connected with medicine and healing. In spite of the excel and care of the ancient Egyptian in medicine, he saw that each disease had outer symptoms that could be cured with medicines and inner hidden causes that could be a result of counter effect of invisible forces or evil spirits. That's how medicine and magic mixed together for the ancient Egyptians. The magicians in ancient Egypt were known with Hari-Hotep title. This may have a connection with the title of Gheri-Hebet, or the one who performs rituals, from which came the translation of the reciting priest. The magicians carry the title of Hari-Hotep in the New Kingdom era, while they carry the title of the writers of the scripts of the god since the late period. The priests in ancient Egypt were highly cultured and educated, and in knowledge of many sciences in many fields. Magic itself was a science that was based on knowledge and books. Amongst the most famous magicians was Didi and the magician Jaja Emanch. There was a mention of their magical powers and their status in the papyrus of West Kar. There was another famous magician from the Ramesside period known as Meri Ra, according to what came in Vandier papyrus and what was pointed out in two magical papyri from the 1st and 2nd centuries AD, known as Seteni I and Seteni II. They talk about the passion of Prince Was Emanch, the son of Ramesses II, in monuments and magic and all what's ancient and in some magic story. The priest Waib played a role equal to the priest Heri Teb and the reciting priest Ghari Heb. The purity of the priest was essential to protect himself from the vicious attacks of the ruthless goddess Sekhmet, for he can be protected from the evilness and magic of the evil goddess Sekhmet and turns her into the good image of herself, goddess Bastet. He had also played a role in the House of Life Peranch as a doctor who has the ability to cure from diseases which are considered among the acts of god Sekhmet II. Practicing magic was not confined to the priests of Waib, but whoever knew the magical texts and was able to practice and apply it was eligible to practice magic. The job of magic was connected with the job of the writer, who is entitled with the book of the god, considering that he is the one who keeps the archive, and the writer in the House of Life Peranch. The magicians were also connected with medicine and religion, so it's obvious that the magician would have knowledge of sciences, especially medicine, and to be from the priest level. The magical practices in ancient Egypt were among the common facts, and they include oral rituals and other practical ones. These rituals were written on palettes and small magical statues and figurines and plates. Apart from that, they were confirmed and acknowledged in some books, like the Book of the Dead. There was a segment dedicated to Osiris to describe the enemy. In it, the enemy of the god equates the enemy of the person who himself turns into Osiris. The text says, "Look, Osiris, this bad enemy who sits between God and people and the dead came to destroy your house and its door, for the enemies to gloat of you." These are words told above a small statue of the enemy made of wax. On its chest, the name of the hateful enemy is written by the fork of the sea fish, and is placed into the ground in the place of Osiris. The tools used in performing both the oral and practical rituals varied. Some of them were used in the small wax and healing statues and the palettes of Hor Shed. Then the spells and writings that were written and recorded on these tools, as well as the water poured on them to be full of the contents of the spells and texts, and the rest of the tools that are related with magic or the priest who performs a magic operation. The oral rituals were usually followed by practical rituals, for the text was recited above a small statue that represents the enemy made of wax or pottery or a new papyrus written over with new ink, then sealed with a seal that may carry the traditional image of the enemy. The text is ended by a well-known formula used in the medical texts and ensures the effectiveness of this ritual. Accordingly, the small statue must be buried in a place known as the place of the execution of the verdict. In Esna Temple, the enemies who are represented in the form of a lion were hit, while the fish coincided plainly with the enemies as well as the birds, who were regarded as being the spirits of these enemies, especially in the Ptolemaic temples. Hunting and fishing was a magical ritual, and there were many forms and texts that are related to the fishing operation, especially in the temples of the late periods, through which we can understand the meaning of what came in the scenes of catching fish and the beasts in the tombs and temples throughout the old ages. It's noticeable that these scenes has a creed and magical content, for the enemies who are represented in animal shapes were erased from existence. Among the mysteriousness of all the rituals related to hunting, fishing, or hunting with nets is the most ambiguous ones. Besides, the idea of hunting with nets goes to older origins when the nets were connected with another world, and the voyage of the deceased in it, which may handicap the journey of the bad or guilty dead. The means of punishing the evil and guilty ones varied. Among these means is a net, which the deceased wishes to avoid falling in it as a bird or a fish. In the spells that's concerned with escaping from the net are the coffins texts dedicated to the subject of the net, in which the deceased tried hard not to fall in. In these spells, the different parts of the net equal parts of the bodies of the deities, or some of the tools and weapons of these deities. For the deceased to escape falling in the decoy of the bird's hunters, being a bird, and from falling in the nets of the fishermen, being a fish, he needed to know the tools of these gods, and the different parts of the net that were set between the sky and the earth, and that can catch the spirits of the dead who were on their way from earth to sky, or those who fly to the west. Then he could acquire the power needed to avoid falling in their danger. The two chapters number 53a and 153b of the Book of the Dead talk about the spells needed to escape from the net and protect the dead from falling into the net of the birds, catchers, and the nets of the fishermen. There are many magical texts that talk about hunting and catching people in the nets, and they are texts that accompany the scenes of the rituals and told during the performance of these rituals. It's essential to tell the name of the enemy if the matter concerns a certain enemy, and not in general for jinx and pessimism, and thus to accomplish the defined purpose of destroying and eliminating that enemy. Mentioning the name of the enemy is a part of the practical rituals that were practiced to destroy Set and Apophis and the dangerous dead. The name plays an important part in the frame of the Egyptian magic, for the name indulges and is mixed totally with the entity of its owner, and can replace him, whether he's a god or a human. The practice of magic was based to a great deal on using the name, so knowing the name is a first requirement in any practice that happens against someone. It's noticeable that destroying and damaging the name is a certain destroy in the future for the owner of that name, and that's what had happened during Amarna period in destroying and smashing and removing Amun's name off the walls of his temples by Akhenaton and his followers, and the followers of the creed of his god Aton. Likewise, the followers of Amun later destroyed the name of Akhenaton and the creed of Aton after Amarna period was over, for it was considered against the Egyptian traditional creed throughout its ages. So they agreed to erase all what represented it and annihilate it completely, so that he or his creed isn't immortalized through the preservation of the name. There are many segments and magical texts that were told for the effect of the magic to take place, or for the protection and getting rid of the anti-magic. These texts were inscribed on papyrus or statues or magical tablets in abbreviations or in explanations, and in non-understood way in many cases. These texts were told during the performance of the verbal rituals. In addition, some of its segments came in the coffin's texts and the Book of the Dead to protect the deceased from what may face him in the afterlife. It also came in the papyri and the temple's reliefs. The magical mythologies were told beside the texts and the magical spells, in addition to the stories and myths that held within their content a magical purpose. Amongst them are a number of religious mythologies that are connected with deities and magic among gods. Amongst them is what came in Westcar Papyrus, and the legend of Isis and Ra, and the scorpions of Isis, and the story of the brothers. The Papyrus of Westcar is a story of Cheops and the magicians. It was published by Erman and was written during the Hyksos times, but its content and its story regarding its framework and composition goes to a much older time. The story goes back to the 7th dynasty. In spite that the beginning of the text is missing, but it's evident that it's composed of a group of stories and tales that are connected with each other, and their events go back to the 4th dynasty, and in particular the era of King Cheops, the owner of the Grand Pyramid. The story tells that the king was bored and invited his sons to ask each of them to tell him a story to entertain him. The core of these short tales revolves around the magician or the reciting priest. The princess told him some adventures that had happened in an older period, and that's in the beginning of the Old Kingdom, and precisely in the time of King Cheops.